afternoon, good evening to also those who are watching us on web TV. My name is Maher Nasser. I'm the Director of the Outreach Program Division in the Department of Global Communications. I'm very pleased and honored to welcome you to Knowledge, History and Power, an important conversation featuring two extraordinary journalists, Nikole and Laura Trevelyan, as well as the esteemed scholar Dr. Natasha Lightfoot, who will moderate today's discussion. Welcome to those of you who are watching on web TV and all here with us in person. This event is one of several that we have organized this year at the United Nations Department of Global Communications, specifically the Outreach Program on the Transatlantic Slave Trade and Slavery. Under the 2023 theme, every year we have a theme for the program, and this year's theme is Fighting Slavery's Legacy of Racism Through Transformative Education. The racist legacy of the transatlantic slave trade continues to reverberate today in harmful prejudices and beliefs that impact the lived experience of people of African descent across the world. At a time when the information and media ecosystem on social media and traditional media are besieged with mis and disinformation, and we're seeing more and more of that today, and in some cases with distortion or instrumentalization of the past that fuels hatred, bigotry, racism, and prejudice, this conversation could not be more important and timely. Brian Stevenson, the Executive Director of the Equal Justice Initiative, who said this in his appearance earlier this year here at the United Nations headquarters. And I quote, "I don't think the great evil of American slavery was the bondage and the brutality. The truest evil and the greatest evil was the narrative we created to justify slavery. This false narrative that black people aren't as good as white people, that black people are less capable, less worthy, less human, less evolved, less decent. That narrative was the great evil because it gave rise to an ideology of white supremacy and racial hierarchy. So when slavery ended, that narrative didn't. So that's why we continue to have racism. Today's discussion will consider the role of knowledge in terms of understanding how this history impacts the lived experience of people of African descent and the systemic power structures of racism, racial discrimination, and white supremacy. The conversation will offer us insight into some of the best practice and the most pernicious challenges that are part of the painstaking work to demand that this history, a history that belongs to all of us, is acknowledged and has a place in our media discourse that is not misrepresented, trivialized, distorted, or erased. We will also hear how those whose ancestors profited from the trade enslaved in Africans can make amends and contribute to the process of reconciliation and healing that is needed to help us build a more just and equitable future for all. This event takes place within the context of the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that will be observed on the 10th of December 2023. In September of this year, in connection with the release of a new United Nations Human Rights Office report entitled "How to Effectively Implement the Right to Participate in Public Affairs, a Spotlight on People of African Descent," the High Commissioner for Human Rights stressed that states need to recognize that behind contemporary forms of racism, dehumanization, and exclusion is a failure to acknowledge responsibilities for enslavement. End of the quote. Since its foundation, the United Nations has been guided by the principle that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights and have the potential to contribute constructively to the development and well-being of their societies. 75 years ago, for the first time, the international community agreed on a set of common values and acknowledged that rights are inherent to every single human being. These rights are enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a blueprint for international human rights norms. and it is said that it's the most translated document on the planet. It can be found in 500 languages. The 75th anniversary of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights provides an opportunity for us to reflect and commit to practice actions to advance equality and combat racism and racial discrimination. I would like to express my sincere appreciation to the Universities Studying Slavery for collaborating with the outreach program on the Transatlantic Slave Trade and Slavery at the United Nations Department of Global Communications to host this important event. This consortium comprises of over 100 global institutions of higher learning focused on sharing best practices and guiding principles as they engage in truth-telling education projects focused on human bondage and the legacies of racism in their histories. This collective was created out of the University of Virginia's President's Commission on Slavery and the university to ensure that UVA's important work would spread beyond Virginia and to respond to the calls for guidance from other universities. It is now my pleasure to introduce Professor Natasha Lightfoot to moderate today's conversation. Professor Natasha Lightfoot is a specialist in slavery, emancipation studies, Black identities, politics, and cultures in the fields of Caribbean, Atlantic world, African diaspora history. She is an associate professor in the Department of History and a faculty fellow in the Department of African, American, and African Diaspora Studies at Columbia University. A member of the Universities Studying Slavery Consortium, Professor Lightfoot is deeply committed to raising awareness of the global impact of the 400-year-long transatlantic slave trade. Dr. Lightfoot,
such a kind introduction. It's an honor to be invited to moderate this important conversation on knowledge, history, and power. Thank you to the United Nations Department of Global Communications Outreach Program on Transatlantic Slave Trade and Slavery and Universities Studying Slavery. It's my pleasure to introduce the two esteemed speakers who have joined us for today's conversation. Nikole Hannah-Jones is the Pulitzer Prize-winning creator of the 1619 Project and a staff writer at the New York Times Magazine. The book version of the 1619 Project, as well as the 1619 Project children's book, Born on the Water, were both #1 New York Times bestsellers. Her 1619 Project is also now a 6-part docuseries on Hulu. Hannah-Jones has spent her career investigating racial inequality and injustice, and her reporting has earned her the MacArthur Fellowship, also known as the Genius Grant, as well as the Peabody Award, 2 George Polk Awards, and the National Magazine Award 3 times. Yeah, I'm not cutting down your many accomplishments. She also serves as the Knight Chair of Race and Journalism at Howard University, where she founded the Center for Journalism and Democracy. Hannah-Jones is also the co-founder of the Ida B. Wells Society for Investigative Reporting, which seeks to increase the number of investigative reporters and editors of color. And in 2022, she opened the 1619 Freedom School, a free after-school literacy program in her hometown of Honolulu, Iowa. And amazingly, she is not tired. Also a tireless advocate is Laura Trevelyan, a journalist who is an anchor and a correspondent for BBC News. Laura is an honorary associate fellow at the P.J. Patterson Institute for Africa-Caribbean Advocacy at the University of the West Indies, and a trustee of the Trevelyan Grenada Reparations Fund. She left the BBC News in March 2023 after a 30-year career, following her family's historic trip to Grenada in February of 2023, where she led the Trevelyan's public apology to the Grenadian people for the role of their ancestors in enslaving Africans on the island. Laura is a co-founder of Heirs of Slavery, a group of British people whose ancestors profited from the enslavement of Africans in the Caribbean. Heirs of Slavery is encouraging other families with similar histories to acknowledge this fraught past and calling on Britain's government to engage in reparatory justice talks with Caribbean governments. Laura is also co-hosting a new podcast with Clive Lewis, a member of the British Parliament, called The Heirs of Enslavement. Laura and Clive are linked by a painful history centered in Grenada, where Clive's ancestors could have been enslaved by Laura's. With that, let's dive into our conversation. So Nikole, I'm going to start with you. During your recent visit to the UN for the International Day to remember the victims of slavery in the Transatlantic Slave Trade, you told the UN News that, quote, history in many ways is about power. It is about who gets to shape our collective understanding, who gets to shape our collective memory, and that power that does not want us to understand the history that delegitimizes that power. Can you elaborate further on your sense of the dynamics of power in the way history is told? How does your work within the 1619 Project and beyond it help to address these sorts of power? If it's not, yeah.
Is it on now? Oh, it's on now. Okay. Always good to see you. Great to meet you. Thank you to the United Nations for hosting me again. I thought maybe after my reparation speech I might never be invited back, so glad to be back here. So much of the work that we do and the work that the United Nations has been doing around the decade marking the Transatlantic Slave Trade and the crimes against humanity are about power. The reason the 1619 Project exists, the reason I imagine so much of your scholarship exists, is because people in power have been able to shape what we commonly think of as history, but what is really memory. Because all of the history that I write about, that you write about, it happened. We just don't learn about it, or we learn about it through a very particular lens. And there's a reason for that. Because if we just think about the United States and how our collective memory really shapes the policies we support, shapes the way that we think about the ways America is exceptional, in that we're exceptionally unequal, right? We're exceptionally carceral. We're exceptional in that of all of the Western industrialized nations, we're the only one whether you can go to the doctor if you're sick, depends on if your job wants to offer you health insurance. And yet, because of the nation, because of the stories that power has shaped, the narrative that power has shaped about who we are, we accept these things because we actually think these things are a sign of our freedom. We actually think that these things are the things that make us great as a society. So what our work is doing is trying to trouble those narratives and to really wrest from the hands of power who gets to shape our collective understanding, our collective identity, and therefore what we collectively accept in our society.
Thank you for that. Laura, I'm going to ask you a similar question building off of Nikole's response about how you think your work also seeks to address these power dynamics and the ways that our collective understanding and the historical memory of slavery is being shaped.
Thank you, Natasha, and thank you, Nikole. It's such a pleasure to be on stage with both of you, and as someone who was the BBC's UN correspondent here some time ago, it's a pleasure to be back here. And I will say that when I read Nikole's initial article in the New York Times Magazine, it was like a lightning bolt, because you explained something to me that I hadn't even really realised. In the 1619 project, you exposed how slavery is at the heart of America's founding. But to me, you illuminated how American slavery is British slavery, and how it was all the same thing. And yet, in school, I was taught that Britain abolished slavery in 1834, long before those terrible Americans who took such a long time to do it. So I wasn't even taught that in the sense that America was a colony and therefore British American slavery was British slavery. None of these, so you joined the dots in a way. It's so obvious, and yet it's not how we were taught, to your point about power. Now, the British writer George Orwell wrote that Britain is like a wealthy family, and I'm paraphrasing, which feels guilty about its hidden source of income. So its hidden source of income being slavery. And in a sense, the history of my family in that way is like a microcosm of the history of Britain, because my father's generation knew nothing about our family links to enslavement in Grenada. My generation certainly didn't, until University College London performed an extremely important public service and upended the narrative, because they published, unbelievably, well, it's unbelievable when you think that it was the slave owners in Britain who were compensated in 1834, not the enslaved. They were compensated for the loss of what was termed their property, because that was the intellectual justification for the dehumanizing system of industrial slavery, was to think of people just as property. So therefore, logically, when it was abolished, of course, the slave owners had to receive compensation, otherwise the bill would never have got through Parliament. There would have been no, this is just how things were. So when you see, I'll put online the details of the 46,000 claims in 1834 from all these little old ladies writing in and claiming for their enslaved Africans that they owned across the British Caribbean. When you see that in black and white, to Nikole's point, the narrative is transformed, and you realise how the powerful wish to conceal this narrative because it's ugly, as George Orwell said, it's shameful. And then as soon as slavery was abolished in Britain, Britain was off to the races. It was Britain that was leading the charge. It was Britain that was the saviours. It was Britain that was policing the high seas and stopping the slave trade. And that's the narrative that we're told. So unpacking all of that and saying that actually wealth, privilege, power in Britain today is related to the wealth from slavery, is related to the exploitation of others, that's incredibly important. That's what I tried to explore in a documentary in Grenada. And the other thing is that I found is to be led by the Caribbean, where people have known this legacy, have known the truth for so long, and yet have really essentially been forced to profit from British tourism, to have daily flights from British Airways and Virgin, and to put a cheery face on it, because this is how money is made. You don't want to insult or upset the tourists who are coming 3,000 miles to see you and to provide you with a livelihood. So there's so much in it that is hard and is complicated. But when I went to Grenada, I was just so delighted to email Nikole, another important Nikole, but Nikole Philip Dow this time, Vice Chair of Grenada's Reparations Committee, and I emailed Nikole, she a descendant of the enslaved in Grenada, me a descendant of enslavers, and I said, oh Nikole, I would love to come and talk to you and make this BBC documentary, and I pressed send, not knowing quite what would happen. And Nikole just wrote back with a smiley face emoji. You know, where have you been all this time? Yes, come on, let's get going. And through that, through Nikole, Hilary Beckles, Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, Maureen Shepherd, PJ Patterson, the multitude of Caribbean intellectuals who since capitalism and slavery have been thinking, articulating, generating these ideas. You know, CARICOM has a 10-point plan for reparatory justice. Our family adapted that for us with the help of the Caribbean. It all begins with an apology and then repair. So I hope that between all of us we can begin to challenge the narrative that for hundreds of years we've all absorbed.
Thank you for that. It's so funny because as a professor who teaches Caribbean history, I teach my students often about the history of abolition and the important place that Britain likes to claim for itself, and the fact that they like to pat themselves on the back for ending the slavery they started. Once you realize that they started it, then
That bit is
that helps.
never mentioned.
Right, exactly.
The starting it bit.
And, you know, it's also very clear when you look at the descendants of the people who made those claims you talk about in the compensation records, that you can trace the lineage to many powerful in the modern day Britain, including many prime ministers, leading politicians, and other.
I forgot to mention also the King of England.
Right.
The current king, you know, it was the royal family that at the inception of the slave trade gave it its imprimatur with the Royal African Company. So it actually had a royal warrant, the company that shipped the enslaved Africans to the Caribbean. And the new king has said that he's supporting academic research into the links of the royal family to the slave trade, but as anybody will tell you, the links are extremely well known.
And in the meanwhile, in the United States, it's just the Civil War, you know, and the law around that as an emancipationist project, but obviously all of the violence that happened for the next century afterwards of Black people is, again, something less taught, less known. But with that, I do want to talk about people in power. My next question to you both is the fact that, you know, many in powerful positions right now around the world say that you need to ignore difficult histories like the slave trade and slavery in order to heal as a collective. So how would you respond to that assertion and why?
Okay, so just quickly to piggyback on what you all were saying before, I find it interesting because, of course, in the United States, we take the opposite approach to slavery, which was that it was the British who thrust slavery upon the colonists, and that even when we talk about the year 1619, what I get all the time is people saying, well, that was the British in 1619, that wasn't us. But of course, in 1776, we make our own decisions to continue slavery, and I can't help but think of in the book Slavery and Capitalism, where it says, it's almost as if the British only began slavery so that they could abolish it, right? So that they could get the credit for abolishing it, which is the way it was brilliant with that one. Exactly. Which is the way we basically do talk about it. The same way with America and the British is you have to deal with the fact that you did engage. Of course, the British were the largest slave traders in the history of the world, and yet you get the credit as being abolitionists. And in the United States, you can say the same thing. Well, yes, we were forced to have slavery because of the British, but when we became free, we fought this whole war to abolish slavery, even though most other countries in the Americas did not have to fight a war to abolish slavery, even though Black people were fighting a war against slavery, which led to abolition. Okay, so that's another lecture. So the question about, you know, it's always interesting to me when the excuse for not talking about slavery is healing. Because we can all just deeply personalize it in your own families. When someone has done something to you, you cannot heal until they have acknowledged what they have done. And we might sit down at the dinner table together. We may not talk about it because we don't want to argue every time we come together, but there's no healing that can happen without acknowledgement. And once you acknowledge, you have to try to repair the harm, or you cannot heal. So this idea that it is the wanting to talk about and address and acknowledge the harm that is causing the division, and not the fact that we refuse to do so. So it is doing what Dr. King says, right? It's a negative peace. It is predicating peace on our silence. It is predicating peace on the fact that the people who are still suffering be quiet about their suffering. And that powerful people be able to reap the benefits of that suffering, and we're just all quiet about it, that is not peace. So clearly, I think so much of the pushback against the work of the 1619 Project, so much of the pushback about all of these texts after the so-called racial reckoning that were trying to force us to acknowledge and grapple with the truth of who we are as a nation, that pushback is understanding that if more of us know what our society was built upon, if we have to draw those connections between the inequality we see today and the system and the society that built it, then the next logical step is to say, well, now we have to do something about it. But if we can just pretend that that history was a long time ago and we vanish banished that history with the Civil War, we banished that history with the Civil Rights Movement, and so where Black people suffer now is because Black people choose to suffer. Then we create policy to address the pathology of Black people. But if you have to say the most logical things in the world, the conditions that people who descend from slavery are living in a society that enslaved them, that everything that you see was built by systems, then you have to do something about those systems. And so we see that pushback because we saw after 2020, all across this country, even large numbers of white Americans, this is the polling that I can never get out of my mind, which is during the height of the so-called racial reckoning, nearly half of Republicans were saying that race was a primary obstacle to Black advancement. Now this is, of course, the party of individual responsibility, the party that says we all have equality now, so Black people suffer as your own fault, you just don't want to take advantage of America, and yet they were saying there's something systemic happening. So if you start to believe that there's something systemic happening, then you try to resolve the problem through systemic change. And why on earth would people in power who benefit from the systems that they and their ancestors have put in place want to see that power challenge? So I think that is, you never hear the people who are harmed, the people who are having to live under the conditions saying, let's just not talk about this so we can heal. You only hear the people who are in power who don't want to have to reflect on where that power came from saying that. And I think, when I think about that the British Crown used to study the role of slavery in building the wealth of the empire. I've spent now several weeks in Amsterdam, where if you take the canal tours, you can take that tour, you can take the Black Canal tour. When you take the Black Canal tour, they point out all of the buildings that actually have Black people carved into the buildings, because that is what paid for those buildings, right? So it's like, we have intentionally buried that history. No one during the height of empire was questioning that their wealth was being built on slavery. This was the first global trade. When you talk about the Industrial Revolution, where was the cotton coming from? Right? It's not, it shows you how powerful memory is, and those who get to shape it, that things that are obvious on their face, that should be obvious on their face, become completely obscured and hidden, to the point where we argue in the United States whether slavery was even profitable. I mean, this is the argument I get all the time, right? Slavery was a pre-modern system, it was not profitable. Which then says all of these, millions of white people engaging in an institution that builds a Black Caribbean. The only reason the Caribbean is Black is because of slavery. Transports at least 13 million people across the Atlantic Ocean is because these white people were so dumb they did not know that doing this was not profitable. That's what we were being asked for 250 years. For more than that, right? Right, 250 years plus. Transform the entire world over something that doesn't make money and they can't figure it out. It's not logical, and yet we believe it. And that shows you how powerful it is. Who gets to decide how we shape our memory and our collective understanding? And so if you have a different understanding, then you choose different policy. And you subvert the way that power is wielded. So, sorry, that was a long answer. But that's really the crux of why we're here, what we're talking about, why there's so much effort to suppress that memory. Because you suppress that memory, then you suppress the reckoning. And if you say all of this wealth you have is not legitimate, then you have to give some of that wealth up. And you have to redistribute some of that wealth to the people who are suffering. And why on earth would the people who benefited from that want us to remember it that way? So no, there is no healing without acknowledgement and redress. You can't just say we did that, we're sorry. You have to say we did that, we're sorry, and this is what we're going to do to fix it. And once you have done that, then we can start to talk about forgiveness and moving on.
All right. Looking to take a bit of the conversation on healing.
Yeah, well, I don't feel like I'm in a good position to talk about healing as a descendant of those who inflicted harm, but I will just tell you a little bit about maybe some of the reaction. And by the way, Nikole is, of course, 100% right that people don't want to have this conversation because it threatens existing power structures. And I say that, I'm no Marxist. My children think I'm a dinosaur, that I'm Mum the dinosaur. The kind of, in Britain there's this website called Mumsnet, which is sort of where mums swap recipes, and basically that's me. I'm definitely the Mumsnet generation. I'm extremely kind of unradical, but I'm big on community. I join everything. But I don't think of myself as being in any way radical. And yet, people in Britain say, "Good God, Laura, what the hell are you doing?" And I said, well, I'm just doing what the Caribbean said should happen, which is you descendants of enslavers should apologise, you should put up some money to you should invest in education specifically, and hopefully that will set an example. And to me that was so compelling that if something that simple could go some way towards redressing the harm of my ancestors, then yes. But in terms of harm, and I realise that I'm not well qualified to talk about this at all, but I'll just tell you some of the reaction that I got. It's very interesting listening to LBC radio in London, which is kind of mass market commercial radio. And all of a sudden, LBC radio is talking about reparations. Oh, this family's gone to the Caribbean and apologised. And they held a big phone in, and a woman phoned in and said, I'm black British, I work in the City of London, every single day I walk past Plantation House. Every single day I feel sad and I feel angry. Because, to Nikole's point, it's hiding in plain sight. The City of London has got a plantation house because the plantation economy was so profitable for London that it was celebrated in the monumental landscape of London today. And she said, and yet no one has ever asked me how I feel about walking past Plantation House. And now I feel like with this apology, and last it's the beginning of a discussion, it's not nearly enough, but now I can go into my workplace and say, hey, Plantation House, you know why it's called that? That's not some sort of pretty idyllic. By the way, the plantations have all got these names like success, hope. It's so sick. But for those that own them, they were indeed successful and hopeful, but the fact that they can even be called that when you think of the conditions, all of it is really unthinkable and very poorly understood in Britain. So that, to me, listening to commercial radio in Britain, finally this discussion is underway. Britain is not like America. Because slavery happened in the Caribbean, it was offshore. So there's never been a proper discussion. And the Windrush generation who came to Britain in search of work, because, by the way, David Lloyd George, Prime Minister of Britain, described the Caribbean as the slums of the empire. So people came to work in Britain in the post-war period because there was no opportunity in the Caribbean. And Natasha, in her book, Troubling Freedom, about Antigua, which I recommend highly, she talks about how after emancipation, the condition of the formerly enslaved actually went backwards because nobody wanted to pay them. She details, it's a great read, but it's chilling. None of this is known in Britain. Emancipation was fantastic. It was all great for the enslaved after that. They were able to have their freedom and make money. Well, Natasha explains why that isn't true in this book. But, sorry, I'm rambling, so I'll try not to ramble. But in terms of harms, when I went to Grenada, Nikole Philip Dow took me around the island, I met many schoolgirls, 15-year-olds, so eloquent, with such an understanding of their position. I said, what are the legacies of slavery? They said, our parents were beaten by their grandparents. They were forced to sit on ants' nests with honey. That's a punishment that comes from slavery. They were whipped by their grandparents. They said the family structure was destroyed by slavery. And to this day, you can see the results of that. There's colorism, the girls told me in Grenada. You know, it's considered favourable to have a light skin. Everybody wants to have a light skin. The girls said, look at our diet. Obesity, hypertension, diabetes. This is endemic in the Caribbean. Look at oil down, the national dish of Grenada. It's a dish that the enslaved made because it was all they had. Pig's feet, coconut milk. It's incredibly unhealthy. Not to mention, obviously the legacies of underinvestment in the Caribbean, the health, education. So Hilary Beckles said to me, Laura, the legacy on your side of the ledger, it was power, wealth and privilege. On ours, it was poverty and illness and a lack of industrialisation, which to some degree continues to this day, which is not to paint the Caribbean societies as victims, far from it. As David Comichon in Barbados, who's in the reparations movement, said, Laura, we are wonder people. Look at what we've achieved with one hand behind our back, which is why the reparations movement, and Hilary Beckles has written a brilliant book, which I would recommend to all of you, Britain's Black Debt. It's about paying back the debt, whether it's in the United States or in Britain. It's really intellectually pretty simple, I would say, and that's how to repair the harm.
Well, this is a really good segue to the next question I wanted to ask, which was about your experiences as journalists in the US and the UK respectively, which are obviously two different countries, but have similar, if not shared histories of enslavement and current social inequality. So from your perspective, what role does public education through the media and journalism play in this struggle to end racism and racial discrimination and raise awareness about the issues that we're discussing today?
So my first love has always been music. And when I was younger, and trying to decide what did I want to do as a career, I really chose journalism over history because I know that narrative shapes policy. I'll keep saying that. I had an understanding that journalists communicate to the masses, journalists set the agenda, right? If we don't cover it, it's not seen as important. And how we cover it determines how people often think about an issue. I think one of probably the most frustrating things for anyone who deals with policy is understanding that facts, data, peer-reviewed research isn't actually what shapes most public policy. It's how people are thinking about those issues and being driven to think about those issues. So, of course, the 1619 Project is based on decades of scholarship by academics, but was able to translate that public scholarship to the public and to kind of bridge that membrane between the academy and just a regular person's understanding, and then to make those connections, which historians don't tend to want to do, right? At least a certain guard of historians who call that presentism, who don't want to draw these direct connections between the past and the present, which I never understand, because I'm like, obviously the past is shaping the society that we live in today. So to me, that really is the power of journalism, is shaping our collective understanding and setting the agenda, and that's what my work has tried to do, is to force us to think about these issues that many of us think we know. I mean, when I was writing about school segregation, it was the same thing. People were like, I know that story, I know where we are. Not really, you don't. And we have the ability to do that. So my experience has been that journalism is a tremendously powerful medium, but too often is being produced by people at the top of the hierarchy who are merely reflecting power and who are merely reflecting the agenda of power. I mean, look at any newspaper in any city in America and see, does it actually reflect the community, or does it reflect who has power in the community and how its power wants to think about certain things? So we could just look at the issue of reparations. We are now seeing reparations being treated as a legitimate political issue for the first time in my lifetime. And that's not coming from activists who have been working on this issue literally since slavery, but from a certain cohort of journalists who had worked at certain esteemed publications, including obviously Ta-Nehisi Coates, who was able to make the case for reparations in the Atlantic. And then all of a sudden, this issue that activists have been working on all of this time starts to gain legitimacy. And now we're able to build on that. And then you saw in a presidential election, reparations being treated as a legitimate political issue for the first time in our lifetime. That is the power that we wield. And so it is critical. You know, I was writing down, so I call myself clearly a descendant of slavery, and that has really entered the public lexicon, that we're not talking about race, which is made up, but slavery produced a condition, and we're all living under that condition. And I love this idea of also heirs of slavery, right? Because we talk about slavery in a way that disconnects white people from the institution. And that also then allows white people not to have to address what is their role then in ameliorating the conditions of that institution. This is what journalism does. Journalism can change the way we talk about these things, the way we understand these things, the language that we use. We call these plantations or labor camps. How are we talking about these things? And by calling it a plantation, that's why you can have a wedding in a place of mass torture and think that's okay. Which you would not do in Germany on a concentration camp, right? We know that. So yeah, now I'm rambling, but you get the point, right? It is the power of, and I make a really bad joke. It's very bad. Obviously, I became a journalist and not a historian because I wanted people to read what I write. But that's a bad joke. It's kind of painful, true. So, of course, many historians like yourself are now also writing, right, for a mass audience and translating this work. But that is the power of what we do. Is I can sit, in my house and just read books for a living, which is what I do, and then write about them, and I can speak to my Uncle Larry at home, who isn't reading those books, but wants that information, and then we can transform the way our society sees these present issues.
Well said. Right. I 100% agree with Nikole. Why was I drawn to journalism? Because it's a platform to influence the public debate in a way in real time. Unlike when you write a book and it takes several years to come out, it's a way to be engaged without necessarily being an activist, but a way to speak truth to power. I mean, I know that that's a complicated concept. It depends, as Nikole said, who owns your media institution. I was privileged to work for the BBC for 30 years, which, all right, it's not perfect, but it's owned by the British public fundamentally, and it's accountable to the British public. People love to beat up the BBC endlessly. But it is still a national treasure and indeed a global treasure. And it taught me a tremendous amount, which I've taken into this work, which is the importance of good storytelling, to Nikole's point. But I would just say, in terms of influential storytelling journalism of this moment on this topic, I just watched The Cost of Inheritance, a new documentary by Yoruba Richard, which is completely fascinating about how, I know that you called it the so-called racial reckoning, Nikole, and I get that, but I think for a lot of white Americans, there was a reckoning. That summer of COVID and George Floyd, and having to think about if police brutality against black men is a continuing legacy of slavery, then what does my wealth, my privilege mean? And in this documentary, you see white women taking on the subject. It's interesting that they're women, I thought. Taking on the subject, talking to descendants of those who indeed their ancestors may have enslaved, and trying to figure it out and trying to act. I think it's a very powerful piece of journalism, which is also advocacy, to Nikole's point. You can do both of these things. A Portuguese journalist recently contacted me who works for Reuters, Catarina Demini, and she sent me a documentary she made in Portuguese. It's called Under the Rug, and she's descended from enslavers. By the way, the Portuguese were the most involved in the actual trade of enslaved Africans. And Catarina, as she said, Portugal's a society where we were a military dictatorship not that long ago, so everything is under the rug. And slavery is just not talked about really at all. Catarina made a documentary with her 100-year-old great-grandmother, looking at documents, explaining the family legacy. They were enslavers who shipped Africans from Angola to Brazil. And Catarina is trying to get traction with this documentary. It's not a conversation the Portuguese want to have at all. There's also a brilliant Reuters podcast at the moment. They just did an edition last week about the King and the current finance minister in Britain, who share a 6 times great-grandfather, George Smith, who was a banker who lent to all the enslavers in the Caribbean. So this is Britain. So their conceit was the man who might have to write the cheque for reparations, Jeremy Hunt, the finance minister, and the King have the same ancestor who bankroll the slave trade. So there's so much that journalism does that's important and powerful, brings things to people's attention. As Nikole said, she, has this, and Nikole particularly has this phenomenal reach on social media. Everything she does has an impact and a ripple, and that privilege, that position, can do a tremendous amount to change the way people see the world.
Well, Nikole and Laura, thank you so much for this insightful engagement on this really painful and difficult history. I'm going to stop there and let everybody give you guys a round of applause. So now to the audience, it is time to hear your questions. Receive questions from both the in-person and online audience. For those in the room, we ask that you please raise your hand if you have a question. And when I call you, please use a microphone on the table and state your name and who you'd like to address your question to. And for the online audience, please use the chat box. We have moderators who will collect your questions and share them with me so that I can read them on your behalf. I'm already getting a number of those. You all online are really animated. And so you also should indicate who you would like to address your question to. So the other thing is we want to accommodate as many queries as possible, so if you can be concise, please do so. So are there any questions in the room? Okay, so first up in the next, yes, and then I saw your hand go up in the glasses, so you'll be next. Well, make myself at a university that has a history of, well, as some of my colleagues have discovered, Columbia itself didn't own slaves, but educated a number of slave-owning merchants, planters, sons of those wealthy men with investments in the U.S. South and the Caribbean. So the initial money that helped to start Columbia on its way absolutely was funded by the slave trade. And there are a number of universities that have varying relationships, even more directly implicated through slave ownership, which many are looking into now. So certainly the first role is, again, acknowledging, knowing the role. Some of the most prestigious educational tertiary institutions in the country are directly tied to the history of enslavement in the South and the Caribbean. So there is absolutely no way that they can continue to do business as usual in light of that fact. What I know that is happening are various kinds of, I don't know, I think I would call them sort of like proto-reparatory moves. I wouldn't say they're all the way reparatory justices yet. So they range from having conversations, courses dedicated to the subject. For instance, there is a long-running Colombian slavery course that many students have taken over the last 10 years or so. There are other more radical measures. The descendants of the various enslaved people who Georgetown had bought in order to keep their doors open, the descendants of those, enslaved people were offered tuition, remission, and the ability to, kind of access the campus in a different way, other than any other set of Black people in Georgetown's history, for instance, right? So there are different measures. There's, the the donation that the University of Glasgow made to the University of the West Indies. What I think the number was somewhere in the realm of 250 million. 20 million. I'm overstating it. I want it to be that. Maybe in my mind, that's what I think it should be. But anyway, or more. But that's still a generous number, enough to again acknowledge the sons of the merchants who were educated. The merchants and enslavers in the West Indies that ended up educated in Glasgow. Can those measures be continued, expanded, vested? Yes. The same is true for the churches. There are so many churches with a long history of enslavement, propping up the ways of the plantation society, creating certain rules around employment for enslaved people and their descendants that absolutely were about encouraging obedience, return to the plantation even after the end of slavery. That all is wrapped up in the story of inequality that these massive institutions with an incredible reach of power have that go well beyond than individual planters and governments. We have many institutions that are part of the fabric of public life in societies with a history of slavery at work in supporting and making slavery run and continuing the inequality that happens after slavery ends. That the atonement measures are sort of just being thought about now. I just saw a Church of England survey being circulated around this issue and wanting to get some input from around the world about how they should go about addressing what could possibly be a reparatory justice program, for instance. So the work is happening. It's scattered, it's slow, it's still, I think, in its infancy, but at least it is happening, let's say. Again, to Nikole's point around the fact that, all these things that I think the generation before us couldn't imagine is now all happening in our lifetime. And reparations is now a really serious issue that's being approached in so many different ways by these different institutions. So let's continue to push them. Because none of these institutions will have accountability if we, as everyday people, don't push them to be accountable, and don't let them sort of rest on the laurels of having inquired without taking the next several necessary steps toward actual, real, meaningful material repair. With that, I don't know if you guys want to take it or if we might move to the next question, because I don't know how much time we have left. Do we? 12 minutes. Woo. Okay, and I have a number of online questions coming in on my phone, but I do want to take the woman in the glasses first, and then I will move to some of the online questions.
Thank you all so much. I wanted to ask what importance you think exists to highlight. Is this still on? Okay. To highlight the contemporary ways that the economic portion of slavery has directly exacerbated the racial divide that exists today, and particularly whether you think that's something that on a mass scale can be kind of boiled down to the individual level. And this is a question for any of you.
So when we're talking about, at least to me, and I believe the larger reparations movement, when we're talking about reparations for slavery, we're not stopping the clock at the abolition of slavery, right? We're talking about the ongoing legacies of slavery. I'm actually working on an essay about this right now. That's why I think the language of descendants of slavery is useful, because we're then speaking about a condition that was placed upon human beings because of an institution. And in the United States, under the 13th Amendment, the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery, but also realizes that simply ending the institution does not end the badges and conditions of the institution. So what they're saying is that even after slavery, we have a constitutional mandate to then eradicate the conditions that were placed upon people of African descent because they were enslaved. So of course, the argument of the 1619 Project is that all across American life, we are seeing Black people living under the conditions of slavery, right? That the legacy of slavery leads to the incarceration, leads to the racial wealth gap, it leads to the housing segregation, it leads to the health outcomes. So I certainly think that the argument for reparations is, of course, for actual slavery. It's then, in the United States at least, for the 100-year period of racial apartheid that descendants of slavery had to live under, which does not end until 1968, less than a decade before I was born. And even under, if you look at under the UN's definition, is for the ongoing harm that people of African descent are still experiencing all across the world. So reparations requires that you acknowledge the harm, but you also have to stop the continuing harm. And that is what repair looks like. So to me, we just have to be more clear with the language that we're not talking about fixing something that happened a long time ago. The same way we understand that wealth is inherited, that rich people today most of them did not create their wealth on their own. That wealth was handed down through generations for work that they had nothing to do with on their own. That the legacies of slavery, that the forced poverty, the forced wealth poverty of African descendant people was also passed down generationally, even as we were facing systems that would not allow us and do not allow us to acquire wealth now. In the interest of time, I'm going to give you all a few of the questions. There are many. It's kind of amazing, but yeah. So, first question is, this is such a great conversation. How do we help young people understand and learn about slavery? Because they think of slavery as happening so long ago. Slavery was a horrible, horrible condition, not a culture. We're descendants from great people. How do we change the narrative in our own communities? That's the first question. Second question, is there any equivalent group to heirs of slavery in the United States? Someone else is also asking the question if there are any other movements in Europe as well, like Spain or Portugal, that are working with the heirs of slavery. Another question is, I have connected with my enslaved descendants and walked the plantation which they still live on. Should the conversation start with the descendants of enslavers? So you can take on any one of those, any or all of those, as you see fit.
Just quickly start, so the question is, there an equivalent group to heirs of slavery? By the way, I was thrilled to hear that Nikole liked the name, because as a sort of tabloidy journalist, I felt, and so did Alex Renton, who was a co-founder, we felt they would just punch through the idea that the people, power, wealth, privilege came to the descendants of the enslavers, and that's still a position that exists today. But it is a kind of controversial thing, so I was thrilled to hear Nikole liked it. Is there an equivalent group? Well, there's some coming to the table in America, and if you see the new documentary, Cost of Inheritance, you'll see that comes from Martin Luther King's famous speech. The part of his dream is that the descendants of enslavers will sit down with the descendants of the enslaved and have a conversation. So that does exist. I wouldn't say it's so activist as heirs of slavery is. I mean, we called on Britain's government to negotiate with CARICOM on the basis of this 10-point plan. But it exists. I went to France actually just at the weekend. I was invited to Nantes by Martinique descendants of the enslaved, and a descendant of a Nantes shipping heir, an 84-year-old man, Pierre Guillaume de Prince, who feels like he's a voice in the wilderness in France in acknowledging that there was great profit from slavery and that there are consequences today. They invited myself and members of my family to go to Nantes because they felt that no one is listening to them in France and they want to have a conversation. And the French always look at le roast beef, as they call the English. So they're seeing what's happening in Britain, they're seeing this conversation, they're like, well, in France, we passed a law in 2001 saying that slavery was a crime against humanity, and that's it, no discussion. Very French, very top down. So they want to go to Martinique, they want to address this legacy. Of course, the French Caribbean islands are not independent, so it's a totally different conversation. The Bequets, as they're known in the French Caribbean, basically the settlers, the economic structure favours the Bequets, is what I was learning in Nantes this weekend. And they want to have a discussion about why things are the way they are, not just in France, but in the French Caribbean. So, and just
I attended a early CARICOM reparations meeting in 2014, and there were Martin Luther King and Guadeloupeans there who had brought claims against the French government and said they've been bringing claims every year for at least a decade prior, and they were always struck down in the name of the fact that they were still colonized spaces, and they were basically friends with men.
yeah,
So there's
France
no
and you know, the French state implies you've got much better public services than the former British Caribbean islands, so I would,
so there's no
exactly,
meanwhile there's always
right.
carry on. Or should, I don't know if any of you want to address any of the other questions. There are many options. So I'll throw out a few more. I love that Portugal was raised. Oh, this was raised by a friend I went to Yale with, Nyasha Lang. Hi, Nyasha. I love that Portugal was raised because until recently they disavowed their role in slavery, as they were one of the first to abolish the trade, although they were the main beneficiaries of it. Are there ways that inter-empire commerce are being traced that could lead to different accountability solutions? This is definitely a question I have because I do think the effort can't just be limited to within empires, within governments, within sort of distinct systems when everybody is sharing money, sharing profits. So this could be a much more full-throated transnational conversation, potentially. Another question, how can a retired person in middle income do something significant for reparations aside just from donating to important educational institutions, museums, etc.? So I think that would be it in terms of time for questions. Please tackle it because we do need to wrap up, unfortunately.
Okay, so I'm going to use the last question to just make my closing remarks. I think that, so I appreciate all of the localized reparations movements, private reparations movements. That's not my battle. I want to see government make repair for what government allowed. And my fear, of course, is that while anyone who can get reparations should get them, they leave out the masses of people who are not ever going to be able to make a specific claim to Georgetown or trace their specific enslaver and get some type of repair. Yet we know in the United States, at least 90% of the black population descends from slavery in the United States. And if we add in people who descend from slavery across the diaspora, it would be nearly, I don't know the percentage, but probably 95%. So I'm really looking at how do we force our governments, who, by the way, put every resource into this institution. I mean, this is the issue, right? Like, okay, I'll give you $50 million. Well, let's calculate the debt, because we can calculate the debt. And if you think that science, law, politics, the arts, the humanities, universities, cities, states, every institution was willing to put unending amount of resources into slavery, into maintaining slavery, into extracting wealth, right? Slavery was an economic system. We like to think of it as a racist system. I think we're more comforted by that, because then we could say, well, we abolished racism in the law, so we have done all that we need to do. But if you understand you transport 13 million people across the Atlantic for profit, not just because you don't like them, and that slavery was a system of extracting 100% of the wealth out of black labor and redistributing that wealth to white institutions. And the same thing for racial apartheid was about trying to get as much of that wealth out of black bodies to white institutions. Then you know that the only real repair is to replace that stolen wealth. That, yes, educational programming, great. What if I don't want to go to college? I shouldn't have to go to college, right? Job programs, great. All of that we should be doing anyway in service to our constituency, our residents, our citizens. But reparations has to be a financial redistribution back to the people whose wealth was extracted from them. So thank you. So when I hear a question, and I appreciate where that last question is coming from, which is these problems are centuries old, they're so systemic. What can I do? Well, as an individual, besides sending me money from my Cash App. Just kidding, no. Just kidding. As an individual, what you need to do is join and use your collective power to push through a reparations bill. That it's not just about, because the thing is, we are telling you what we need as descendants of slavery. But you want to decide, well, I will give to this educational program because I think that is a worthy way of repair. No, repair means the people who had the harm done to them get to say how they get their repair. And what we are saying is we want financial reparations. And so please call your congresspeople or wherever your legislative body is in your country and push them to pass the reparations bill. We actually don't need to study this anymore. I can cite you all of the studies that have already been done. People have already made calculations. What we don't have is the political will to actually do what is right. Just think again. If someone came to your house and stole your wealth, and stole your home, and stole your labor, and then they said, you know what, you're right. We will acknowledge that we committed this great crime against you, and that is all that you are owed. How would you respond to that? So the fact that we think all that is required is an acknowledgement, which most countries don't even want to do that. No, you have to now repay me for what was taken. And I'm sorry if you were living in my house after you took it. I'm sorry that that's uncomfortable for you to have to move out of the house that you stole from me, but that is what is required if you truly want justice. So when I hear these questions, I always ask myself, do you really want justice? Or do you want to feel better after leaving this conversation? Because if you really want justice, there is going to be a little bit of discomfort and the giving up of something that you did not personally earn. So that's how I answer that. Thank you.
Answers to any of the questions, staff?
Yes, I'll be quick because I see it's 2:30. But the question about is there some kind of transnational study? Not that I'm aware of, but what a brilliant idea! Because data is power, as it showed when UCL put online the database of compensation paid to the British slave owners, which revealed to my family and many others exactly how we had profited through inherited wealth. I will just say that as a fellow at the P.J. Patterson Institute for Africa and Caribbean Advocacy, I've been discussing an idea with Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, and P.J. Patterson, about the archives in the Caribbean, these incredible archives in Barbados, Jamaica, Antigua, which now are 400 years old. The archives, the records of plantations, the slave registers, ship manifests, information which could help descendant communities know where they came from. And shouldn't these archives, which by the way are at risk of being destroyed by the next hurricane to hit the Caribbean, shouldn't they be online? Shouldn't they be available to everybody? Shouldn't they have historical context with them as a public information tool? And now you've got the idea of the transnational database. And I just leave you with a final thought, which is from Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, who really has been such a guru to our family and now to so many others, who said reparations is going to be the greatest political movement of the 21st century because it is a movement of love and compassion and healing. And I'll leave you with that.
Thank you again. Please give them another round of applause. So I would love for everyone here and those online, if you can fill out a survey that would be helpful for the United Nations Department of Global Communications. We kindly ask you to scan the QR code on the screen. There's a super quick survey that will take no more than 1 or 2 minutes. For the online audience, you can click on the link in the chat and take some time to complete that survey. In the meanwhile, while you are filling out the survey, I'm just going to take time again to thank the audience for attending and for your really thoughtful engagement, for your questions in person, for those online. Really sorry we couldn't get to everyone's thoughts and questions, but certainly are appreciative of your engagement with us. And just again, thank you for being such a wonderful audience. both of you, Nikole and Laura, for such an incredible conversation. It's wonderful to pick alongside with you and learn from you. So with that, everybody, we're closing the day. Thank you so much again. And hope we can have more.